Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Books and the World, a presentation of the Cape Cod Writers Center. Our book today is called, I wish we had a whole group of musicians around us, it's called Cape Cod Jazz, and it was compiled by our guest, John Basile. Welcome to the program, John.
Pleasure to be here, thank you.
I assume you either know a lot of these people or knew of them. How did the book come about with the title Cape Cod Jazz, and what is it about Cape Cod Jazz? There's enough for the next 40 hours.
Well, yeah. The book came about because I'm a chronic saver of things. I clip newspaper articles and save old photographs. And as a journalist, I said to myself, I'm going to use this someday. And finally the time came, I said, there's a book in this. My original plan was to write a book about jazz musicians from New England. That project turned out to be too large. It would take too long. So I said, well, what do I really know? I know jazz on Cape Cod. And so I narrowed my focus and realized I had something then.
Do you have a direct connection with music in this whole field?
I studied music. I went to Berkeley College of Music for a time. Then I transferred to another college and became an English major. And I've always enjoyed music. I'm an avid record collector, and I play music as an amateur. But I got to know the jazz scene on the Cape by becoming involved with the Cape Cod Jazz Society back in the early 80s when I first moved to the Cape. And it just went from there. So many great names and personalities.
Yes, that was my next question. You mentioned so many different people, so many great musicians, and their connection to Cape Cod.
Yeah, and that's the point I try to make in the book, that these people could play on any stage in the world, a lot of them, and they chose to live on the Cape. Many of the people we call Cape Cod Jazz people are not natives, but they came here from other places and chose to make their lives here. Bobby Hackett and Dave McKenna and I'm leaving so many people out, Marie Marcus, and right down the list.
One of the first people you talk about or write about in your book, John, is Marie Marcus.
Yeah.
Perhaps not as world famous, but certainly famous on the Cape.
Yeah.
What is her background and story? She's gone now.
Yes, she passed away in 2003. Marie is known as the First Lady of Jazz on Cape Cod, and that title was so accurate. She kept jazz going on the Cape for years. She was born Marie Doherty in Boston, was a child prodigy on the piano, and came up playing on radio shows of the day, and eventually got a gig in New York and took her career there, and came to the Cape. She got a booking at the Coonamessett Inn in Falmouth, had never been to the Cape, got off the train on a winter's day and said, what am I doing here?
A typical winter day on Cape Cod.
No idea where she was, played the job, fell in love with the place, and made her life here, raised her family here. And
what sort of music did she play?
She could play any style of jazz, but she was especially good at the stride style, Fats Waller influenced, and boogie woogie, and the older styles of jazz like that. You might call it Dixieland. In fact, some of the first records she made, they were with a band called Preacher, Rollo, and the Saints, which was a Dixieland. In the 50s, there was that whole Dixieland revival that came along. And they tapped into that. They made a lot of records, sold a lot of records. You can still find them on the internet these days. They're out there. And but that was her bass style. But she could play in any style. I've heard her play much more modern things. And she just had a wonderful. She knew all the tunes. That was key, for the jazz players, just to know. There was nothing you could throw at her that she couldn't play, and that was her strength.
And play it very well.
Oh yes, yes. I saw her play in any kind of setting, from a nightclub to a concert stage to somebody's living room, and she was always the same, always good.
Was jazz on the Cape popular, or was it something you had to search for?
No, it was much more popular back in the day than it is now. There was a whole generation that came up in the swing era. They heard the big bands. Jazz was the popular music of the day for many of those people. And so they were much more willing to go out and have dinner and,
Oh.
hear jazz, and different bars and restaurants would feature jazz much more than they do today. So anytime in the 50s, the 60s, right up through the 80s, I think was a golden age of jazz on the Cape.
Yeah, and the players, they played here, they play worldwide.
Yeah, yeah. And you had Bobby Hackett, for instance, just to pick one name. Bobby Hackett, the first thing he did that anybody really remembers was he played that famous trumpet solo on Glenn Miller's String of Pearls hit. Huge hit. That's Bobby Hackett on that featured trumpet part. But he didn't join the Glenn Miller band as a trumpet player. He joined as a guitar player. That's the kind of talent he was.
That's the kind of story you have in the book, too.
Yeah. So there was Bobby Hackett. He came to the Cape because he wanted to be here, but he could work anywhere. He did more than a dozen albums under Jackie Gleason's name in the 50s. These lush orchestral settings with Bobby in the lead.
Almost background music.
Yeah, yeah. And he, that was how many people knew him. But as a Dixieland player, as a traditional jazz player, he was the best.
Who are some of the others?
Well, let's bring it a little closer to home. Lou Colombo. Lou was one of that Brockton crowd that came up. So much talent came out of Brockton. Dick Johnson, another alto sax player. But Lou decided to make his home on the Cape in the early 70s, I think.
Yeah.
And he could play. Dizzy Gillespie called him his favorite trumpet player, so that's high praise. And that quote's been verified. Lou could engage an audience. As soon as he walked out on the stage, he had you in the palm of his hands. He was just a great personality. I'll tell you, the first time I met Lou Colombo, when I was working in the radio business, he came to the radio station to be interviewed on our talk program, and I heard them talking to him about how he used to be a ball player, and now he's a jazz trumpet player. I'm thinking, well, this is my favorite guy. Those are my two favorite things, baseball and jazz. So I was a big fan right from that.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to watch him in action probably half a year before his passing.
Yeah.
And he was playing at the restaurant.
In Hyannis.
Yeah,
which his family owns, the Roadhouse.
Roadhouse.
Yes. And that was Lou. He could just engage an audience, play any tune you could think of.
Exactly.
He could play it modern. He could play it old-fashioned. He could play the blues.
Well, I had a friend of mine with me that night, and his wife, my wife, and we all went to the Roadhouse. And I knew that Lou Colombo and a group was playing. There wasn't a large group, probably about 5 people.
Yep.
And I passed a request for 2 of our favorite songs, and they're offbeat.
Yeah.
You know, if you ask many cafe musicians to play Green Dolphin Street, they'll look at you and say, what's the name? Or Here's That Rainy Day, which is a lovely song.
Yeah.
And without a hesitation, his little group, Lou in front of it, played beautiful renditions of both of them.
That was Lou, and he got some people mad too, because he would play the trumpet with one hand and he would hold the mouthpiece off center, and you're not supposed to do that. But the proof is in the pudding, as they say.
You have a couple of pictures we're talking about Lou, and he's got
always over here, instead of center.
His left hand. He's holding his trumpet instead of the configuration you usually see, holding the trumpet with the cords and playing the valves up on top. And he would do it, and it worked.
Yeah, so can't complain.
Yeah. What about the places they played at, John?
Well, there's a whole chapter devoted to that in the book. There was, the most famous is probably the Columns, and that worked its way into the title. It's From Colombo to the Columns.
Yeah, and that's the subtitle of your book.
People just love that place. It still exists, just a short distance from where we are today on Route 28 in West Dennis. It's been vacant for I don't know how many years, 20 years or more. And Warren Meadows ran it back in the 60s and 70s. He passed away very young, and it was taken over by a group of musicians, Ron Ormsby among them, and he ran it for a number of years as a very successful jazz club, and people still rave about it. It had the big white column. It was a sea captain's home, I guess, and at some point it had these big columns added to it. It looked more like a southern house or something, a mansion or something. And I can tell you my columns story is years before I even lived on the Cape. Driving along Route 28, I'm just here as a tourist like so many other people, and I see on the marquee tonight Clark Terry, who was one of my favorite jazz trumpet players, the greatest. I couldn't believe it. So of course I pull off the road, I go in. And as a young trumpet student at the time,
yes.
I was bowled over, and there's Clark Terry on stage with a small crowd, maybe 35 or 40 people in the place for this world-class talent. And sat there, enjoyed the show, introduced myself at intermission, and when I told him I was studying trumpet with a good friend of his, Lenny Johnson, in Boston, I was his pal at that point. So it's an evening I'll never forget. He was just...
You made a point there. You said I was his pal. I think most of those musicians were so friendly.
Yeah.
You know, if you appreciated music and came to hear them,
yeah.
Well, there was a camaraderie there.
They appreciated that you appreciated them.
Yeah.
They were regular people. Underneath all that talent, they were real, genuine people, that generation.
We're talking about a book called Cape Cod Jazz, subtitle From Colombo to the Columns. You mentioned the columns. You said that it was successful for a while. Music, restaurants, they have a high fatality rate. They're popular for a while, if indeed they ever get popular.
Yeah.
And it's a tough road hoe.
It is. Especially if you want to bring in big talent, that's expensive. And but in the summertime, you could sustain that on the Cape for some years. And because people, you know, they were up to enjoy themselves. They were here on vacation, and maybe they wanted to have a good time, and they were willing to pay for that. But as that generation sort of passed along, it was more difficult to do that. And Ron Ormsby, who ran the place with some partners, said he just decided to close it down. It was still, you know, successful, but it was just time to do other things. And as a working musician, you know, he had other things to do too, and so did the other partners. One
of the other venues that you mentioned in your book, John, Cape Cod Jazz, is the Bornhurst.
Bornhurst on the canal.
Now, we have pictures of the Bornhurst, both the building and the ballroom, which is enormous.
Yeah. That was at the very start of the whole big band era, and when people would go dancing in an evening and enjoy themselves. And Bornhurst was opened in the early 20s when that era was really just starting. But I documented that Duke Ellington played there regularly. Mm-hmm. And this was the early Ellington band. This was before he was the name we know him to be today. But he played there all the time. The Mal Hallett band, which was another sort of, they would call a territory band. They were New England based. And Mal Hallett had Cape Cod connections, and he would play there quite often. Bands of that nature would come through there routinely.
How often were they? Was it a weekly thing, Saturday night dance?
Yes, and in the summertime, I think they were open every night. And the details it's so far back on something like that. The Bourne Historical Society was very helpful in getting me some pictures of that and filling in a little bit of details with some old newspaper clippings and things. But Bornhurst suffered 2 fires.
Oh.
One, after the first, they rebuilt. After the second, the owner said no more.
And the building is not there anymore.
It's gone. Yeah, it's there. You can see where it used to be, right not too far from the Bourne Bridge, and it backed right up to the canal. It must have been a beautiful spot to go dancing and stroll by the canal on a nice summer's evening, have dinner.
You mentioned Mal Hallett. When I was a kid, I mean a real little kid, I lived in Eastern Connecticut. Yeah. And we used to go to the beach in London, Ocean Beach.
Oh, yeah.
And they had a ballroom. Everybody had a ballroom
right.
back then. And this would be in the early 30s, mid-30s.
Sure.
and Mal Hallett played at the Valhalla Ballroom at Ocean Beach in New London, Connecticut.
They always said of the Mal Hallett band, they were loud, and they weren't really a nightclub band. They were for the concert hall or the dance hall in those days.
The other places, what other places were there? Were there many of them?
Yeah, there were a lot more than we have today. And in fact, one of the things I did as I researched the book, I'd look up old newspaper advertising, and you'd see so many little places that are just completely forgotten now. The names don't even ring a bell when you ask people about them. But one that comes to mind is the Club Panama in Hyannis. Club
Panama?
Yeah. Right on Main Street in Hyannis. There's a picture of it in the book, which I was able to find in an old postcard. And it's got to be from the 30s. Main Street in Hyannis was two-way traffic then, so you tell you how far back it was.
Back then, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a neighborhood place, but jazz was played there a lot. And Larry Marsland, who's a very well-known singer and entertainer on the Cape, wrote a play, which he called the Club Panama, and based it on that place. I think his parents met there, and so he worked that into the story. But that was the kind of place that existed routinely. And I'm sure not just on the Cape, every city and town probably had its places like that. But that was what the Cape had, and because the Cape drew so many tourists from all over, those places became very popular.
Were there a lot of them?
Yeah, there were. Another place in West Yarmouth, the Sandy Pond Club comes to mind, which was way out in the woods. And it was almost a speakeasy.
Oh,
but
they had music.
Had music, always jazz, yeah. It was
and live music.
Live music in those days, yeah.
You write in your book, Cape Cod Jazz, John Basile, Storyville.
Storyville.
There was a reaction there. Tell me about Storyville.
It's like a dream to jazz fans, a dream come true. George Wein, who we know as the founder of the Newport Jazz Festival, had a club called Storyville in Boston, which he would close in the summer. And he was looking for something to do for the summer months, and hit upon the idea of a jazz club on the Cape. He connected with his friend Paul Nossiter, very well-known local jazz musician and teacher on the Cape, and they found this property in Harwich, which I think was an old motor inn, hotel or something, and they operated Storyville, Cape Cod there for 4 summers, I think, 57 through 60, or 58 through 60, and they had every name jazz artist you could think of, from Ellington to Louis Armstrong to Jerry Mulligan, Ella Fitzgerald, everybody you can think of in that era played there.
I understand that Billie Holiday played or sang on the Cape.
She did. I know she performed at the Atlantic House in Provincetown. I have in the book, I quote an account that I dug up from an old newspaper story. Reggie Cabral owned it in those years, and he would bring in jazz talent that was just unbelievable. Jerry Mulligan, nice pictures of Jerry Mulligan and Zoot Sims playing there in the summer of '60, I think it was. And these days, researching the book, I was just looking around for whatever references I could find, and I came across some photos taken by a writer by the name of John Reynolds, who lives in Ontario, and I found him again through the internet. You can do these things these days. I contacted him. He gave me permission to use his beautiful photos of Jerry Mulligan at the Atlantic House, and he took those pictures when he was just here as a college student, just like so many kids did in those days. Let's go down to the Cape and spend a week, and it happened to be the day that my favorite Jerry Mulligan was there, and he happened to have his camera.
Just happened to have his camera there.
Great pictures. Yeah. He was very gracious to let me use them.
Yeah, in your book, the book we're talking about today, Cape Cod Jazz, toward the end of it, you have quick little bios of so many famous musicians. Well, here, I just opened the page and I was looking for it. Here's Lou Colombo up here with a whole story about him. Here's
Greg Abate, who's a very contemporary player, plays on the Cape all the time now.
He's still working.
Yes, and he's in the book. Greg's a good friend, and he one of his first real important gigs was on the Cape. He's from Rhode Island, but he lived on the Cape for several years. In the early 1980s, had a band called Channel One, which was a very, almost a rock band, but it was jazz rock. And that's really one of the things that gave Greg his start. And he spent several summers here, very popular. The Cape was their base, and they would work all over New England.
Now here's Dick Wetmore over here.
Oh, Dick Wetmore. There's a story. You're in the section now just talking about Dick Wetmore's records, but there's another whole chapter about him earlier in the book. And he was the surprise of the book for me as I researched it. I knew his name a little bit, but I didn't know much about him. And as I dug in, that's the reporter and editor in me. I'm digging a little bit more. I didn't just
I don't know if we've mentioned that you're the editor of the Register, the newspaper.
Yes.
As a great access to all the files.
Well, that helped, yeah.
The Register goes back how far?
Oh, till the 1839, I think.
Well, who was playing at the corner of Main Street and the West End in 1888?
Yeah, I need some research on that.
It's there somewhere.
But having access, yeah, and more than that too, having my training is in journalism, and so I approached it. I didn't want to just repeat stories I'd seen or newspaper clippings I found. I wanted to do my own research wherever possible. And so that's getting back to Dick Wetmore. The more I found about him, the more I knew I needed to go a little deeper. And I was able to connect with Dick Wetmore's nephew or great nephew, Jamie Wetmore, who, this is pure serendipity, he had compiled an oral history with Dick Wetmore of his long career, and he was so generous to let me use it in the book and quote it. It's unpublished, still unpublished, except for the parts now I've quoted in the book. And Dick was one of those characters. He had a long struggle with alcoholism and was really out of music for quite a long time. But got back into it, made a whole second career here on the Cape. Another one of those multi-instrumentalists. He played the jazz violin, but he also played the trumpet and cornet. And he could play in any style. He played in blues bands and rock bands as well as a jazz musician. And I first knew him because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big Jerry Mulligan fan, and I would see Dick Wetmore's name on a certain long-lost Jerry Mulligan album, playing as part of the Vinnie Burke String Quartet. They were the house band on the Tonight Show. I think when Jack Parr was the host, way back. And they recorded this album with Jerry Mulligan, so I'd see the name, but I never knew much about him. Then when I connected it to the Cape, I said, well, here's somebody I need to know more about. And I made this contact with his nephew, and he turned out to be one of the biggest chapters in the book. He was such a compelling story that, he had this musical career that was interrupted, and he landed on his feet and ended up playing with a symphony orchestra behind him, and an original composition he'd written. So it was kind of a nice ending for him.
Jerry Mulligan had a bass saxophone?
Baritone sax.
Baritone saxophone.
Yeah.
Real down.
Yeah. And he was famous for the pianoless quartet. He had just trumpet, baritone sax, bass, and drums, no piano, and that was his contribution to jazz.
All right, I opened the book again. Dave McKenna.
Oh, Dave. I'm surprised we haven't talked about him yet. The strongest left hand in jazz. He was a marvelous piano player. He didn't really need a bass player in his band because that left hand was so good. Dave was the consummate, the pianist's pianist, if you know what I mean. Could play.
Piano players would come to listen to him.
Absolutely. And one of these guys, again, who played around the world. He could play anywhere, but chose to live on the Cape. He was another Rhode Island guy, landed on the Cape, and he was always being written about in the jazz magazines and in the New Yorker, long profiles of him. People just loved him. Yeah. And
John Basile, you mentioned in your book, and you mentioned here today, that a lot of people, musicians, came to play on the Cape, but became Cape residents.
Over and over, I heard that story that, there was something that drew me to the Cape. I wanted to stay here. And these were guys who could play anywhere in the world, and they did. But something brought them back to the Cape. Ruby Braff, another trumpet player.
Ruby Braff.
Ruby
yes.
was a wonderful character. And he told me the same thing. He said, how could I leave this place? Look, he said, I live near the beach. When I have to go to a gig, I get on an airplane, I go, and I come back to the beach.
Isn't that nice? Yeah. I envision a group of musicians strolling across the edge of the parking lot at a beach at dawn with the sun coming up, and they're playing Sunrise Serenade.
There you go. That's a great image.
Yeah. All right, as we wind down our program, we have just moments left. Compiling the book, Cape Cod Jazz, John, what did you find that you might not have known about music on the Cape?
That's a good question. I found that it was, jazz in particular, was much more part of daily life on the Cape than I ever thought it would be. There were so many places where you could hear jazz, and so many people had an interest in jazz. We haven't even mentioned the Cape Cod Jazz Society, which I was involved with for a number of years. So many people had this common interest of jazz that they wanted to form this club and put on concerts and hold meetings and have a newsletter. It was much more a part of people's lives.
Is the Cape Cod Jazz Society still in existence?
No, it's not. It petered out about a decade ago. As that generation just sort of aged out, and another generation just never came along to keep it going. Well, Jack Bradley, I have to mention Jack Bradley, who was the founder of the thing and kept it going for so long. And without him, there wouldn't be Jazz on the Cape.
Well, we thank you, Jack. And we thank you, John. And
thank you.
And if you're interested in music, if you're interested in Cape Cod, if you want to blend the two of them together, this is the book, Cape Cod Jazz, by our guest today, John Basile. There's a beautiful foreword by Dick Golden, who's known to many people on the Cape for his radio work, and for your radio work, and for your newspaper work. John Basile, thank you for coming in. I enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the music just thinking about it and reading them on the printed page.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And we thank you, because without you looking in, we'd just be talking and enjoying every minute of it anyway. Thanks for viewing today's episode of Books in the World, a presentation of the Cape Cod Writers Center. And again, thank you for viewing. Thank you, John.
My pleasure.